Baby's love transforms aggressive bears to gentle giants, the power of pure innocence. The mountain air hung thick and strange that morning, carrying something Jacob Bennett couldn't quite name. He stood on the porch of their rented cabin, coffee mug warming his hands, watching the mist roll through the pines like ghostly fingers searching for something lost. Jessica was inside with baby Lily, their 6-month-old daughter, and the soft sounds of morning routine drifted through the screen door. They had come here for peace, for a break from the city's endless noise, but the silence that wrapped around them now felt different from what he expected. It wasn't the gentle quiet of nature at rest. It was the kind of silence that made his skin prickle, the kind that came before storms or after something terrible had passed through. The birds weren't singing. Even the wind had stilled itself to nothing more than a whisper through the branches. Jacob took another sip of coffee and tried to shake off the feeling. They had driven 8 hours to reach this cabin, nestled deep in the Colorado mountains where cell service was spotty and the nearest neighbor was miles away. Jessica had found it online, drawn to the photos of towering pines and the promise of complete isolation. "We need this," she had said, bouncing Lily on her hip while scrolling through the listing. "Just us, no distractions, no schedules, just family." He had agreed, though now, standing in this peculiar morning stillness, he wondered if complete isolation was what they really needed. The rental owner, an older man named Connor Adams who lived down in the valley, had warned them about the wildlife. "Bears come through sometimes," Connor had said, his weathered face serious. "Big ones. Grizzlies mostly. They're not like the black bears you might see in other parts. These ones, they're different. More aggressive. Lost a few dogs to them over the years." Jacob had nodded, promised to keep the garbage secured and food locked away. But Connor had looked at him strangely then, as if there was more he wanted to say but couldn't find the words. The screen door creaked open and Jessica stepped out, Lily cradled against her chest in a soft carrier. "It's so quiet," she said, her voice barely above a whisper, as if speaking too loudly might break something fragile in the air. Jacob nodded, pulling her close with his free arm. "Yeah, I noticed that too. No birds." Jessica frowned, looking up at the trees. "That's odd, isn't it? There were so many yesterday when we arrived." They had been everywhere yesterday, filling the air with chirps and calls, darting between branches in flashes of brown and red. But now the trees stood empty, their branches still as painted scenery. Lily made a small sound, not quite a cry, more like a question, and Jessica bounced gently to soothe her. "Maybe there's a storm coming," Jessica suggested, though the sky above was clear, a perfect autumn blue that seemed to go on forever. They went inside for breakfast, but the strange quality of the morning followed them. The cabin was cozy, all wood panels and stone fireplace, decorated with the kind of rustic touches that city people found charming. Mounted deer heads watched from the walls with glassy eyes, and Native American blankets draped over leather furniture. Jacob cooked eggs while Jessica fed Lily, and they tried to talk about normal things, about the hike they planned for later, about how well Lily had slept in the new environment. But their conversation felt forced, like actors reading lines they didn't quite believe. Every few minutes, one of them would glance toward the windows, though neither mentioned what they were looking for. The feeling of being watched had settled over the cabin like a heavy blanket, pressing down on them with invisible weight. It was Jessica who saw them first. She had been standing at the kitchen window rinsing Lily's bottle when her hand suddenly stopped moving. The water kept running, splashing against the sink, but Jessica stood frozen, her eyes fixed on something outside. "Jacob," she said, her voice tight with controlled fear. "Jacob, come here, slowly." He moved to her side, following her gaze out the window, and felt his breath catch in his throat. At the edge of the clearing, where the forest began its dark embrace, 3 massive shapes stood motionless among the trees. Bears. But not like any bears Jacob had seen in nature, documentaries, or zoos. These were giants, their dark fur catching the morning light in a way that made them seem almost mythical. The largest one, in the center, must have been 9 feet tall on all fours, its head massive and powerful. Its eyes were looking directly at the cabin. "Don't move," Jacob whispered, though the bears were at least 50 yards away, well outside the cabin walls. "They're just passing through, they'll move on." But the bears didn't move on. They stood there, perfectly still, like monuments carved from living flesh and fur. The large one in the center never broke its gaze from the cabin, and after a moment, Jacob realized it wasn't just looking at the building. It was looking at them, at the window where they stood. Its eyes were dark and deep, holding an intelligence that made Jacob's stomach twist with primitive fear. "Should we call someone?" Jessica asked, her voice barely audible. "Connor, the ranger station?" Jacob reached for his phone, but of course there was no signal. There never was up here. That had been part of the appeal, the forced disconnection from the world. Now it felt like a trap. Minutes passed, though it felt like hours. The bears remained motionless, watching. Lily began to fuss in Jessica's arms, picking up on her parents' tension, and Jessica moved away from the window to comfort her. Jacob stayed, unable to look away from those 3 massive forms. There was something wrong about how still they were. Bears didn't behave like this. They foraged, they moved, they investigated, or they left. They didn't stand guard like soldiers. They didn't watch like sentinels. The largest bear shifted slightly, just a small movement of its massive head, and Jacob saw its nostrils flare. It was smelling the air, reading the scents that drifted from the cabin. Could it smell them? Could it smell Lily? The thought sent ice through his veins. "They're not leaving," Jessica said from behind him. She had moved to the living room window, which offered a different angle of the clearing. "Jacob, why aren't they leaving?" He didn't have an answer. In all the warnings about bears, all the safety videos and ranger talks, nobody had ever mentioned this. Bears that just watched. Bears that stood still as statues while maintaining eye contact with humans behind walls. It wasn't natural. It wasn't right. "Maybe they smell food," he said, grasping for rational explanations. "I'll check that everything's locked up." He moved through the cabin, checking windows, ensuring the door was bolted, confirming that all their food was sealed in the bear-proof containers Connor had shown them. Everything was secure. When he returned to the window, the bears hadn't moved an inch. The day crawled forward with agonizing slowness. They tried to go about normal activities, tried to pretend that 3 enormous predators weren't standing guard outside their temporary home. Jessica played with Lily on the rug, singing soft songs and making her stuffed animals dance, but her eyes kept darting to the windows. Jacob attempted to read, but the words swam meaninglessly on the page. Every few minutes, one of them would check, and every time the bears were still there. They didn't forage. They didn't lie down to rest. They just stood, watching, waiting for something neither Jacob nor Jessica could understand. As the sun climbed higher, details became clearer. Jacob could see scars on the largest bear's face, old wounds that spoke of battles survived. Its fur wasn't uniformly dark, but had patches of lighter brown, almost golden in the sunlight. The 2 smaller bears flanking it were still massive by any standard, but they seemed to defer to the central giant, occasionally turning their heads toward it as if checking for signals. "We should document this," Jessica said suddenly, grabbing her phone. "No one will believe us otherwise." She started recording video through the window, narrating in a whisper. "There are 3 grizzly bears outside our cabin. They've been standing there for, what? 2 hours now? They're not moving, just watching us." Through the phone screen, the situation looked even more surreal, like something from a horror movie where the monsters were patient, intelligent, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. But they didn't strike. They didn't charge or roar or claw at the cabin walls. They simply maintained their vigil, as patient as mountains, as still as death. Lunch came and went, though neither Jacob nor Jessica had much appetite. They forced themselves to eat sandwiches, to maintain some semblance of normalcy for Lily's sake if nothing else. The baby seemed oblivious to the danger, gurgling happily as Jessica fed her mashed bananas, reaching for the spoon with chubby fingers. It was almost possible, in those moments, to forget about the watchers outside. Almost. But then Jacob would catch a glimpse of dark fur through the window. Or Jessica would hear something that might have been breathing, heavy and deep, and the fear would rush back like cold water. They were trapped. Not physically, perhaps. The bears hadn't tried to prevent them from leaving. But psychologically, emotionally, they were prisoners in the cabin, held captive by those unblinking eyes and the terrible patience of predators that refused to act like predators. As afternoon shadows began to lengthen, something changed. The middle bear, the giant, took a step forward. Just one step, but after hours of stillness it might as well have been a charge. Jessica grabbed Lily and pulled her close, and Jacob found himself moving toward the fireplace where a poker leaned against the stone, though what good it would do against something that size he couldn't imagine. But the bear stopped after that single step. It lowered its massive head slightly, nostrils flaring again, and made a sound. Not a roar or a growl, but something softer, almost like a question. The 2 smaller bears shifted their weight but didn't advance. They seemed to be waiting for something, some signal or sign that Jacob and Jessica couldn't interpret. "What do they want?" Jessica whispered, rocking Lily, who had started to fuss again. What could they possibly want? Jacob shook his head, his hand tight on the poker's handle. His mind raced through possibilities, each more unlikely than the last. Were they sick? Rabid? But rabid animals didn't behave with such calculated patience. Were they protecting something? Cubs, perhaps? But there were no cubs visible, and these bears were too large to be young mothers. The behavior defied every piece of conventional wisdom about wildlife encounters. These bears weren't acting like wild animals at all. They were acting like they had a purpose, like they were there for a reason that went beyond instinct or hunger. The sun began its descent toward the mountain peaks, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink that would have been beautiful under different circumstances. The bear's fur caught the golden light, making them look almost magical, like creatures from old stories his grandmother used to tell. Stories about animals that were more than animals, about forests that held secrets older than human memory. Jacob had always dismissed those stories as folklore, primitive attempts to explain a world that science had since decoded. But standing here, watching these impossible watchers, he wondered if perhaps there were things science hadn't quite figured out yet, things that existed in the spaces between what was known and what was believed. Jessica had put Lily down for her afternoon nap, though it had taken longer than usual. The baby could sense her parents' stress, even if she couldn't understand its source. Now Jessica stood beside Jacob at the window, her hand finding his, their fingers interlacing with desperate strength. "We can't stay here tonight," she said. "Not with them out there. What if they try to get in?" Jacob squeezed her hand, though he wasn't sure if he was comforting her or himself. "The cabin's solid," he said. "Connor said it's been here for 60 years. It's weathered worse than this." But had it? Had it ever been surrounded by bears that acted like guardians rather than beasts? Bears that watched with such intense focus that it felt like being studied, evaluated, judged? As if responding to their conversation, the large bear moved again. This time it sat down, its massive bulk settling onto the ground with surprising grace. The other two followed suit, arranging themselves in a semicircle facing the cabin. They looked almost comfortable now, like dogs settling in for a long wait outside their master's door. But these weren't dogs, and Jacob and Jessica weren't their masters. These were wild grizzlies, apex predators that could tear through the cabin door like paper if they chose to. Yet they sat there, patient and watchful, as the day died around them and shadows grew long and dark. "Maybe we should try to make a run for the car," Jacob suggested, though even as he said it, he knew it was impossible. The car was parked on the other side of the clearing, directly in the bear's line of sight. They would have to walk within 20 feet of the animals to reach it, carrying Lily, completely exposed. It would be suicide. "We wait," Jessica said firmly. "We wait until morning. Maybe they'll be gone by then." But her voice carried no real hope, and Jacob could see in her eyes that she didn't believe her own words. Whatever had brought these bears here, whatever held them in place like living statues, it wasn't something that would simply disappear with the dawn. Night fell like a curtain dropping, sudden and complete in the mountains. Jacob built a fire in the fireplace, more for the psychological comfort than warmth. The flickering light danced on the walls, creating shadows that seemed to move with purpose, and every creak of the old cabin made them both jump. They couldn't see the bears anymore, lost in the darkness beyond the windows, but somehow that was worse. At least during the day, they could track the animals' positions, could see that they weren't approaching. Now, every sound could be massive paws on the porch. Every whisper of wind could be heavy breathing against the walls. They tried to maintain normal evening routines. Jessica bathed Lily in the small tub, singing the same song she always did, though her voice trembled on the high notes. Jacob cooked dinner, pasta with jarred sauce, simple and comforting. They ate in near silence, the only sounds the clink of forks on plates and Lily's occasional babbling. The baby seemed happier now, as if the darkness had washed away whatever she had sensed during the day. She played with her favorite toy, a stuffed rabbit with long ears that she liked to chew on, completely oblivious to her parents' fear. After dinner, they sat together on the couch, Lily between them, trying to pretend they were just a normal family on vacation. Jessica had brought books for Lily, bright board books with pictures of farm animals and colorful shapes. She read them aloud, her voice steady and warm, and for brief moments Jacob could almost forget about what waited outside. But then a branch would snap in the darkness, or something would brush against the cabin wall, and the illusion would shatter. They were not alone. They had never been alone since morning, and the watchers were still there, invisible now but undeniably present. "Do you remember," Jessica said suddenly, "what Connor said when we picked up the keys?" Jacob thought back to that meeting, which seemed like weeks ago now, rather than just 2 days. He said the bears were different, more aggressive. Jessica nodded, but her expression was thoughtful rather than frightened. "But that's not what these bears are doing, is it? Aggressive animals attack or leave. They don't wait." She was right, Jacob realized. Nothing about this matched aggressive behavior. It was something else entirely. Something that had no name in any wildlife manual or ranger's guide. Maybe they're not aggressive, he said slowly. Maybe Connor meant something else. Maybe different means this. They put Lily to bed in the small bedroom, her crib positioned away from the window, though they couldn't say why that felt important. She went down easily, tired from the strange day, and soon her soft breathing filled the room. Jacob and Jessica stood over her for a long moment, watching her sleep, drawing strength from her innocence. She didn't know about the bears. She didn't know about the danger that surrounded them. In her dreams, the world was still safe and warm and full of love. They closed her door quietly and returned to the living room, where the fire had burned down to glowing embers. "We should take shifts," Jacob suggested. "One sleeps while the other watches." Jessica agreed, though they both knew sleep would be nearly impossible. They pulled the couch closer to the fireplace, arranged blankets and pillows, and settled in for what promised to be the longest night of their lives. Jessica took the first watch while Jacob lay down, though his eyes remained open, staring at the ceiling where firelight shadows danced like cave paintings come to life. Every few minutes, Jessica would get up and check the windows, peering into the darkness for any sign of movement. But the night gave nothing away. If the bears were still there, they were invisible, swallowed by the mountain darkness that pressed against the cabin like a living thing. Around midnight, they switched positions. Jessica curled up on the couch while Jacob sat in the chair, poker across his lap like a medieval knight's sword. The fire had died completely now, leaving only darkness and the faint starlight that filtered through the windows. He could hear Jessica's breathing, not quite sleep, but close, and from the bedroom came Lily's occasional sleep sounds. Small sighs and murmurs that made his heart ache with protective love. He would die before he let anything happen to them. He would fight bears with his bare hands if necessary. But even as he thought this, he knew how futile it would be. Those bears outside, if they chose to act, would go through him like tissue paper. A sound from outside made him freeze. Footsteps. Heavy, deliberate footsteps on the wooden porch. The boards creaked under enormous weight, and Jacob's hand tightened on the poker until his knuckles went white. The footsteps moved slowly, pausing at what must be the door, then continuing around the side of the cabin. He could track the movement by sound alone, imagining the massive form investigating the human shelter, testing for weaknesses perhaps, or simply satisfying some unfathomable curiosity. Jessica stirred but didn't wake, and Jacob remained perfectly still, afraid that any movement might trigger something, might transform investigation into invasion. The footsteps completed their circuit and stopped again at the door. There was a sound like breathing, deep and rhythmic, and Jacob realized one of the bears was standing directly on the other side of the wooden barrier. Only inches of wood separated them from hundreds of pounds of muscle and claw. The breathing continued for what felt like hours, but was probably only minutes, and then, as suddenly as they had come, the footsteps retreated. The porch boards creaked again as the weight left them, and then silence returned, deeper and more complete than before. Jacob didn't move for a long time after that, listening for any sign that the bear might return. But there was nothing, just the normal sounds of the night, wind in the trees and the distant call of an owl that had finally decided it was safe to speak. He checked on Jessica, still curled on the couch, then walked quietly to Lily's room. The baby was sleeping peacefully. One small hand curled around her rabbit's ear, completely unaware of how close danger had come. He stood there watching her, drawing strength from her innocence, until his legs began to ache from standing still. The rest of the night passed without incident, though Jacob never relaxed his vigilance. As the sky began to lighten in the east, painting the mountains in shades of purple and gray, he finally allowed himself to hope that the ordeal might be ending. Perhaps the bears had satisfied whatever curiosity had brought them here. Perhaps they had moved on in the darkness, returning to whatever wild life they had temporarily abandoned. He woke Jessica gently, and together they moved to the window, hearts pounding with anticipation and dread. The bears were still there. They hadn't moved from their semicircle position, though now Jacob could see that their fur was covered with morning dew, proof that they had sat there through the entire night. The large one in the center lifted its head as if sensing their observation, and once again those dark eyes found Jacob's through the glass. But something was different now. The intensity was still there, the focused attention that had been so unnerving yesterday. But there was something else too, something Jacob couldn't quite identify. The bear's expression, if bears could have expressions, seemed almost expectant, as if it was waiting for something specific, some event or signal that would explain everything. Jessica made coffee while Jacob started breakfast, and they tried to recapture some sense of normalcy despite their surreal circumstances. Lily woke happy and hungry, and Jessica fed her while humming softly, though her eyes kept drifting to the windows. The morning sun climbed higher, warming the cabin and chasing away the night's shadows, but it couldn't chase away the mystery of their watchers. If anything, daylight made the situation more bizarre. In darkness, strange things seemed possible, even natural. But in the clear light of morning, 3 massive bears sitting like patient dogs outside a cabin was so far outside normal experience that it felt like they had slipped into some alternate reality. "We need to try something different," Jessica said suddenly. She was standing at the window with Lily in her arms, studying the bears with the same intensity they showed toward the cabin. "They're waiting for something. From us, I think. We need to figure out what." Jacob joined her at the window, looking at the 3 massive forms. What could bears possibly want from humans? We don't have anything they need. But even as he said it, he wondered if that was true. These bears weren't behaving according to any known pattern. Maybe they did want something. Something that had nothing to do with food or territory, or any of the usual animal motivations. As if responding to their discussion, Lily made a sound, a happy gurgling laugh that she often made when she saw something interesting. She was looking directly at the bears, her small hand reaching toward the window, fingers opening and closing in the gesture she used when she wanted to touch something. Jessica shifted her position to move Lily away from the window, but the baby protested, reaching more insistently toward the glass. "She's not afraid," Jessica said wonderingly. "Look at her. She's not afraid at all." It was true. While her parents had spent the last day in various states of terror and confusion, Lily showed no signs of fear. If anything, she seemed delighted by the bears, treating them like the large dogs she sometimes saw at the park. "Babies don't know to be afraid," Jacob said, but he was watching Lily's reaction with interest. She was usually shy around strangers, human or animal, but something about the bears had captured her attention in a positive way. She kept reaching toward them, making her happy sounds, as if she wanted to play with them. It was ridiculous, of course. These were wild grizzlies, not pets. But Lily's reaction was so different from theirs that it made Jacob wonder if perhaps they were missing something, some crucial piece of information that would make sense of everything. The morning progressed with the same strange tension as the day before, but now there was a new element. Lily remained fascinated by the bears, and several times Jessica had to pull her away from the window when she became too excited, reaching and calling out in her baby language. Each time Lily vocalized, the bears seemed to shift slightly, their ears moving to track the sound. The large one in particular seemed attentive to the baby's voice, its head tilting in a way that looked almost curious. It was anthropomorphizing, Jacob knew, attributing human characteristics to wild animals. But he couldn't shake the feeling that the bears were specifically interested in Lily. Around midday, something changed. The bears stood up, all three rising to their feet in synchronized movement that was both graceful and terrifying. Jacob grabbed the poker again, and Jessica clutched Lily tighter, both preparing for whatever was about to happen. But the bears didn't approach. Instead, they began to move in a slow circle around the cabin, maintaining their distance but clearly investigating something. They would pause every few feet, noses to the ground, then continue their circuit. It looked like they were tracking something, following a scent trail that only they could detect. "What are they doing?" Jessica whispered, moving from window to window to keep the bears in sight. Jacob followed, trying to understand the pattern of their movement. They weren't random in their investigation. They seemed to be following a specific path, one that spiraled gradually inward toward the cabin. "It's like they're looking for something," he said, "or following something." The bears completed one full circuit, then began another, this time slightly closer to the cabin. Their movements were deliberate, purposeful, nothing like the casual foraging Jacob had seen in nature documentaries. On their third circuit, now only about 20 feet from the cabin, the large bear stopped suddenly. It was near the side of the cabin where Lily's bedroom window was located, and it stood there for a long moment, nose raised to the air. Then it did something that made both Jacob and Jessica gasp. It sat down directly beneath Lily's window and looked up at it. The other two bears joined it, arranging themselves in their now familiar semicircle, but this time their attention was focused on that single window rather than the cabin as a whole. "They know," Jessica said, her voice tight with a mixture of fear and wonder. "They know she's in there. They can smell her or sense her somehow." Jacob felt his protective instincts flare, but along with the fear came a strange realization. The bears had been there for over 24 hours. They'd had countless opportunities to attack, to break in, to do whatever bears do when they're aggressive. But they hadn't. They had maintained a respectful distance, never approaching closer than necessary, never showing signs of aggression despite their incredible size and power. They were waiting, watching, but not hunting, not threatening, just present. Lily had been napping, but woke with a cry, the sudden sound sharp in the quiet cabin. Jessica went to get her, and Jacob stayed at the window, watching the bear's reaction. All three heads turned toward the sound, ears pricked forward, and the large one made that same soft sound it had made yesterday, almost like a question. When Jessica returned with Lily, the baby was fussy, rubbing her eyes and whimpering in the way that meant she was still tired but unable to settle. Jessica bounced her gently, humming a lullaby, but Lily continued to fuss. Then something extraordinary happened. The large bear, still sitting beneath Lily's window, began to make a sound. It wasn't a growl or a roar or any of the aggressive sounds Jacob expected from a grizzly. It was a low, rhythmic rumbling, almost like a purr, but deeper, more resonant. The sound seemed to vibrate through the ground and up into the cabin walls, a physical sensation as much as an auditory one. And incredibly, impossibly, Lily began to calm. Her crying stopped, replaced by curious silence, and she turned her head toward the window as if she could see through the walls to the source of the sound. "That's not possible," Jacob breathed, but he was seeing it happen. The bear continued its strange, rumbling vocalization, and Lily relaxed completely in Jessica's arms, her eyes growing heavy again. Within minutes, she was asleep, more peacefully than she had been since they arrived at the cabin. The bear's sound gradually faded away, and it lowered its massive head to rest on its paws, still watching the window, but now with what looked like satisfaction. The other two bears had also relaxed, their postures less alert, more comfortable, as if some important task had been completed. Jessica and Jacob looked at each other, neither able to voice what they had just witnessed. It challenged everything they thought they knew about wild animals, about the relationship between humans and nature. These bears weren't just watching them. They were, what? Protecting them? Comforting their child? The thought was insane. But what other explanation was there? The large bear had deliberately soothed Lily with a sound that no wildlife guide had ever mentioned, a behavior that suggested not just intelligence but empathy, understanding, connection. The afternoon passed in a strange, new dynamic. The bears remained beneath Lily's window, occasionally making their rumbling sound when she stirred in her sleep. Jacob and Jessica found themselves relaxing slightly, the constant edge of fear dulling into something more like cautious curiosity. They still didn't understand what was happening, but it no longer felt immediately dangerous. Whatever the bears wanted, it didn't seem to be harmful. If anything, their behavior suggested the opposite, though Jacob couldn't bring himself to fully embrace that thought. These were still wild animals, still dangerous, regardless of their current peaceful demeanor. As evening approached, Jessica made a decision. "I'm going to take Lily outside," she announced, and Jacob felt his heart stop. "Jessica, no, we can't." But she was already preparing, wrapping Lily in her warmest clothes, her face set with determination. "They've been here for 2 days, Jacob. If they wanted to hurt us, they would have. And you saw what happened earlier. They're here for her somehow. I don't understand it, but I feel it. They're not going to hurt her." Every instinct Jacob had screamed against this plan, but he could see Jessica wouldn't be deterred. And somewhere, deep in a part of his mind he didn't want to acknowledge, he knew she was right. The bears weren't a threat. He didn't know what they were, but they weren't that. They compromised. Jessica would step onto the porch with Lily, just for a moment, while Jacob stood ready with the poker and his phone recording everything. If the bears showed any sign of aggression, any movement toward them, Jessica would immediately retreat inside. It was still insane, still went against every piece of wilderness safety advice ever given, but something about this entire situation had moved beyond normal safety considerations. These weren't normal bears, and this wasn't a normal encounter. Rules that applied to regular wildlife might not apply here. Jessica opened the door slowly, carefully, every movement deliberate and non-threatening. The bears' heads all turned toward the sound, but they didn't stand, didn't approach. They simply watched as Jessica stepped onto the porch, Lily held securely in her arms. The baby was awake now, alert and curious, and when she saw the bears, she made a sound of pure delight. Not fear, not uncertainty, but joy, as if she was seeing old friends. She reached out her small hands toward them, babbling excitedly in her baby language, and the large bear's ears moved forward, listening. What happened next would stay with Jacob for the rest of his life. The large bear slowly, carefully, with movements so controlled they seemed almost conscious of their potential threat, stood up. It took one step forward, then another, each movement deliberate and slow. Jessica stood frozen on the porch, Lily still reaching toward the approaching giant. Jacob gripped the poker so tight his hands hurt, every muscle tensed to rush forward if needed. But the bear stopped about 10 feet from the porch, still a respectful distance, and did something extraordinary. It lowered itself down, not sitting, but lying down completely, making itself as small as an 800-pound bear could make itself. It was a gesture of submission, of non-threat, unmistakable in its intent. Lily laughed, a bright, clear sound that rang through the evening air and reached even more insistently toward the bear. And the bear, this massive predator that could kill them all with a single swipe of its paw, made that rumbling sound again, softer this time, almost gentle. The other two bears remained where they were, watching but not interfering, and for a long moment the world seemed to hold its breath. Then, as slowly as it had approached, the large bear backed away, returning to its position with the others. Jessica stepped back inside, closing the door with shaking hands, and collapsed into Jacob's arms. "Did that just happen?" she whispered against his chest. "Did we just—" Jacob held her and Lily close, his own body trembling with released tension. "I don't know what just happened," he admitted. "But yeah, it happened." Lily seemed completely unaffected by the encounter, gurgling happily and playing with her mother's hair. To her, apparently, meeting a giant grizzly bear was no more unusual than any other part of her day. The innocence of it, the pure acceptance without fear, was both beautiful and terrifying. They spent that evening in a different state of mind than the previous one. The fear was still there, but it had transformed into something more complex. Wonder, perhaps. Awe at something beyond their understanding. The bears remained outside, their patient vigil continuing, but it no longer felt like a siege. It felt like, what? Guard duty? Protection? The thought was ridiculous, but Jacob couldn't shake it. Every time he looked out at those massive forms, he saw not threat, but purpose. They were there for a reason, and that reason, impossibly, seemed connected to Lily. That night, they all slept in the living room, making a bed of cushions and blankets on the floor. Lily lay between them, safe and warm, occasionally making small sleep sounds that both her parents found impossibly precious after the day's events. The bears were invisible in the darkness, but their presence was felt, a weight of attention that should have been terrifying but somehow wasn't. Jacob found himself thinking about old stories, myths, and legends about guardian spirits and forest protectors. He had always dismissed such tales as primitive superstition, but lying here in the darkness with his family, knowing that 3 massive grizzlies sat watch outside, he wondered if perhaps those old storytellers had known something modern people had forgotten. Jessica woke once in the night, and Jacob felt her hand find his in the darkness. "Do you think they'll leave?" she whispered. "When we go home, do you think they'll let us leave?" It was a question Jacob had been avoiding. But now he had to face it. What if the bears didn't want them to go? What if this strange connection, whatever it was, meant they were trapped here? But even as he thought it, he knew that wasn't right. The bears hadn't shown any possessiveness, any desire to keep them captive. They were watching, waiting. But for what? "I think," he said slowly, "they're waiting for something to happen, and when it does, they'll go." But what that something might be, he couldn't imagine. Morning came again. Their 3rd day with the watchers, and the routine of checking the windows had become almost normal. The bears were there, as expected, in their usual positions. But something was different about the large one. It seemed restless, shifting its weight, occasionally standing and sitting back down. The other 2 picked up on its mood, showing similar signs of agitation, though not aggressive, just unsettled. Like they were waiting for something that was taking too long to arrive. Jessica noticed it too, watching them with concern. "Something's changed," she said. "They're different today." As if in response to her words, the large bear stood and walked toward the cabin. Not the slow, careful approach of yesterday, but purposeful movement that made Jacob's heart race. It stopped at the porch steps and made a new sound, not the rumbling purr, but something more urgent, almost like a call. It repeated the sound 3 times, then sat down, looking directly at the door. The message, if it was a message, seemed clear. They wanted something. They wanted the humans to do something. But what? Lily had been playing on her blanket, but at the bear's call she looked up, alert and interested. She made her own sound in response, a babbling string of syllables that meant nothing to adult ears but sent a visible reaction through all 3 bears. Their ears pricked forward, their bodies tensing with attention, and the large one made the calling sound again. Lily responded again, louder this time, reaching toward the door with obvious desire. She wanted to go to them. The realization hit both parents simultaneously. Their 6-month-old daughter wanted to go to the giant grizzly bears. "Absolutely not," Jacob said. But even as he spoke, he could see the same thought in Jessica's eyes. This was what the bears had been waiting for. Not just to see Lily, but for some kind of interaction, some connection that went beyond observation. It was insane, dangerous, completely against every parental instinct. But then again, everything about this situation defied normal instincts. The bears had shown nothing but patience, and what could only be described as gentleness. They had soothed Lily when she cried, had made themselves non-threatening when she showed interest. They were not behaving like wild animals. They were behaving like something else entirely. "What if," Jessica said slowly, "we took her out there? Just for a moment. You and I both. Together. If they wanted to hurt us, they've had so many chances. But they don't want that. They want connection, I think. They want to meet her." It went against everything Jacob believed about safety, about protecting his family. But looking at those bears, seeing the intelligence in their eyes, the purposefulness of their behavior, he found himself considering it. What if Jessica was right? What if this was something extraordinary? Something that transcended normal human-animal boundaries? What if saying no meant missing something incredible, something that might never come again? They debated for an hour, going back and forth, while the bears waited with their infinite patience, and Lily grew increasingly fussy, wanting something she couldn't articulate but clearly felt. Finally, it was Lily herself who made the decision. She had been growing more and more agitated, and suddenly she let out a cry unlike any they had heard from her before. Not pain or hunger or tiredness, but frustration, deep and primal. And the bears responded. All 3 stood up, alert and concerned, and the large one made a sound that was unmistakably worried, almost distressed. They were connected somehow. The bears and Lily were connected in a way that defied explanation, but was undeniably real. "Okay," Jacob said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Okay, but we do this carefully. We stay together. Any sign of danger, anything that feels wrong, and we run." Jessica nodded, her face pale but determined. They wrapped Lily warmly, though the morning was mild, and Jacob grabbed the poker, though he knew it was a useless gesture. If this went wrong, no weapon would save them. They would be putting their lives, their daughter's life, entirely in the hands or paws of 3 wild grizzly bears. It was madness. But sometimes, Jacob thought, madness and miracles looked very much alike until you were on the other side of them. They opened the door together, stepping out as a unit, Lily held between them. The morning air was crisp and clean, carrying the scent of pine and earth and something wild. The bears watched them emerge, all 3 sitting now, arranged in their semicircle like an audience waiting for a performance. Lily immediately brightened, reaching toward them with both hands, making happy sounds that echoed across the clearing. The large bear responded with its rumbling purr, and incredibly, Lily laughed. Not a nervous giggle or uncertain sound, but a full, delighted laugh, as if the bear had told her the funniest joke in the world. They walked down the porch steps slowly, Jacob's every nerve screaming danger while his eyes saw only calm attention from the bears. They stopped about 15 feet away, close enough to see every detail of the massive animals, the scars on their faces, the intelligence in their eyes, the way their fur moved in the slight breeze. Lily was straining forward in Jessica's arms, desperate to get closer, and the large bear tilted its head, watching her with what looked impossibly like fondness. Then it did something that took their breath away. It lay down completely, rolling onto its side to expose its belly, the most vulnerable position a bear could take. It was submission, trust, an invitation that transcended species and spoke to something deeper than language. Jessica looked at Jacob, a question in her eyes, and he found himself nodding. They moved closer, step by careful step, until they were only 6 feet from the massive bear. This close, they could see it breathing, see the rise and fall of its enormous chest, could smell the wild scent of it, earth and fur and something ancient. Lily reached out, straining toward the bear, and Jessica, in a moment of either courage or insanity, lowered her down just enough that the baby's tiny hand could brush against the bear's fur. The moment of contact was electric. Lily squealed with delight, patting the fur with her small palm, and the bear made a sound none of them had heard before, a soft huffing that sounded almost like laughter. The other 2 bears watched but didn't move, seeming to understand that this moment belonged to the large one and the baby. Lily continued to pat the bear's fur, babbling excitedly, and the bear lay perfectly still, only its eyes moving to track her movements. Then, with infinite care, it lifted one massive paw, and with a gentleness that seemed impossible for something so large, touched Lily's foot. Just a brief contact, pad to tiny shoe. But Lily laughed again, kicking her feet with joy. The bear withdrew its paw and made the rumbling purr again, deeper this time, and Lily responded with her own attempt at the sound. A baby growl that made all 3 bears' ears perk up with what looked like surprise and delight. They stayed there for maybe 5 minutes, though it felt like hours, like time had stopped to allow this impossible moment to exist. Then, as if by some silent agreement, the large bear rolled back to its feet, standing slowly and backing away. The spell broke, but gently, like waking from a good dream. Jessica pulled Lily back against her chest, and they retreated to the porch, legs shaking with reaction. The bears resumed their watching positions, but something had changed. The tension was gone, replaced by something that felt almost like peace. Whatever the bears had come for, whatever they had needed, it had been accomplished in that moment of contact between massive paw and tiny foot. The rest of the day passed in a dreamlike state. The bears remained, but their presence felt different now, less mysterious and more companionable. Lily napped peacefully, seemingly exhausted by her adventure, and Jessica and Jacob found themselves talking in whispers, as if speaking too loudly might shatter whatever magic had just occurred. They tried to make sense of it, to find rational explanations, but every theory fell short. This wasn't about food or territory or any known animal behavior. This was something else, something that touched on the mystical, the impossible connection between species that shouldn't exist, but somehow did. As afternoon gave way to evening, the bears began to show signs of leaving. They stood more frequently, looked toward the forest, seemed to be listening to something only they could hear. The large one approached the cabin one last time, stopping at the base of the porch steps. It looked up at the windows, as if searching for something, and Jessica, understanding somehow what it wanted, brought Lily to the window. The baby and the bear looked at each other for a long moment, and then the bear made a new sound, soft and final, like a goodbye. Lily waved, her small hand opening and closing, and the bear turned away, walking toward the forest with the other two falling in behind it. They moved slowly at first, as if reluctant to leave, but as they reached the tree line, their pace quickened. Just before they disappeared into the darkness between the pines, the large one turned back one last time. Even from this distance, Jacob could see its eyes, could feel the weight of its gaze. Then it was gone, melting into the forest as if it had never been there at all. The other two followed, and within moments, it was as if the last 3 days had been a dream. The clearing was empty, the forest silent, and only the deep prints in the earth proved that anything had happened at all. Jessica and Jacob stood at the window for a long time, holding Lily between them, watching the place where the bears had vanished. Neither spoke because what was there to say? How did you process something that shouldn't have been possible? How did you explain to others, or even to yourself, what had just happened? Lily seemed unaffected, playing with her rabbit toy as if meeting giant grizzly bears was just another part of growing up. Perhaps for her it was. Perhaps children, in their innocence, could accept miracles that adults had learned to deny. That night, they packed their things. Without discussing it, they both knew it was time to leave. Whatever had brought them here, whatever cosmic coincidence had arranged this meeting, it was complete. The cabin felt different now. Just a building in the woods, no longer the stage for something extraordinary. As they loaded the car the next morning, Jacob found himself looking at the tracks the bears had left, already beginning to fade as wind and weather did their work. Soon there would be no physical evidence of what had happened, only their memories and the video on Jessica's phone that showed 3 bears sitting impossibly still, watching a cabin with purpose no one would believe. The drive home was quiet, each lost in their own thoughts. Lily slept most of the way, occasionally making small sounds that might have been echoes of the bear's rumbling purr. Or maybe that was just parental imagination, finding meaning where none existed. But Jacob didn't think so. Something had happened in those mountains. Something that changed them all in ways they might not fully understand for years. The rational part of his mind, the part that believed in science and logic, struggled to accept it. But the father in him, the part that would do anything to protect his family, knew that those bears had been protectors too, in their own wild way. 2 chapters of Part 1 completed. Weeks passed after their return from the mountains, but the memory of those 3 days remained vivid, like a dream too real to fade. Jacob found himself thinking about the bears at odd moments, wondering where they were, what they were doing, whether they remembered the small human family they had watched over so intently. Jessica had been researching, diving into obscure folklore and indigenous stories about bears, finding tales that echoed their experience in ways that made his skin prickle. Stories of bear spirits that protected children, of connections between humans and animals that transcended the physical world. He wanted to dismiss them as coincidence, but how could he, after what they had witnessed? Lily seemed different too, though in ways too subtle to define precisely. She was calmer, more observant, often staring at things others couldn't see with the same intensity she had shown toward the bears. Sometimes, when they took her to the park, she would suddenly become alert, looking toward the trees with recognition in her eyes, reaching out as she had toward the bears. Dogs, which had previously made her nervous, now drew her like magnets. She would laugh when they approached, patting them with the same delight she had shown with the massive grizzly, and the dogs, invariably, would become gentle in her presence, even the most energetic ones settling into calm submission. One evening, about a month after their return, Jessica called Jacob to Lily's room. "Listen," she whispered, and at first he heard nothing unusual. Then he caught it, a low rumbling sound coming from Lily's crib. Their daughter, their 6-month-old baby, was making the same purring rumble the bear had made. It was softer, higher pitched, but unmistakably the same sound. She was asleep, peaceful, and the sound seemed to be part of her dreams. They stood there, holding hands, listening to their daughter speak in the language of bears, and wondered what dreams she might be having, what memories had imprinted themselves on her developing mind. Connor Adams called them one day, 3 months after their stay. His voice was strange on the phone, uncertain. "I wanted to ask you," he said slowly, "did anything unusual happen during your stay? With the wildlife, I mean?" Jacob and Jessica exchanged glances. They had decided not to tell anyone about the bears, knowing how insane it would sound. But something in Connor's voice made Jacob reconsider. "Why do you ask?" he said carefully. There was a long pause before Connor replied. "The bears," he said finally. "The aggressive ones I warned you about. They're different now. Ever since you folks left, they're different. Calm. They don't raid garbage anymore, don't threaten hikers. It's like they've become completely different animals. The rangers can't explain it. I just wondered if maybe you'd seen them, had some kind of encounter." Jacob told him then, an abbreviated version of events that still sounded impossible even as he spoke it. Connor listened without interrupting, and when Jacob finished, there was another long silence. "My grandmother," Connor said finally. "She was Native American, used to tell stories about things like this. Said sometimes the old spirits would test people, especially people with young children. Test their fear, their trust, their ability to see beyond the surface. She said, if you passed the test, you'd be under their protection forever." He paused, then added, "She also said the children who were touched by the spirits would grow up to be bridges between worlds. Don't know if I believe all that, but, well, your story makes me wonder." They never went back to the cabin, though sometimes Jacob thought about it. It felt like returning would break something, would try to force a miracle to repeat itself. And miracles, he had learned, didn't work that way. But sometimes, on clear nights when the stars were bright, he would take Lily outside and hold her up toward the sky, and she would make that rumbling sound as if calling to something far away. And sometimes, just sometimes, he thought he heard an answer carried on the wind, a deeper rumble from somewhere in the distance, letting them know that the watchers were still out there, still protecting, still connected to the small human child who had shown them trust instead of fear. Jessica started writing about the experience, not as fact, but as fiction, stories about the thin places where the human and natural worlds touched. She never used their real names or the actual location, but the emotional truth of it came through in every word. People who read her stories often commented on how real they felt, how they seemed less like fiction and more like recovered memories of something ancient and true. She would smile when they said this, thinking of 3 massive bears sitting in patient vigil, of her daughter's tiny hand touching wild fur, of the moment when fear transformed into wonder. The video Jessica had taken remained on her phone, never shared, never posted online. Sometimes they would watch it together after Lily was asleep, still amazed by what they were seeing. The bears looked even more impossible on the small screen, their stillness too perfect, their attention too focused. But what struck them most was the moment they had captured of Lily reaching toward them, the pure joy on her face, the absence of fear that should have been there but wasn't. It was proof, if they needed it, that children knew things adults had forgotten. could see with eyes unclouded by years of learned fear and rational skepticism. One day, when Lily was 2 years old and talking in full sentences that sometimes surprised them with their clarity, she said something that stopped them cold. They were looking at a picture book about animals, and when they reached the page with bears, she pointed and said, "Friends, they watch me sleep." Jessica and Jacob looked at each other, chills running down their spines. "What do you mean, sweetheart?" Jessica asked gently. Lily looked at them with those serious eyes she sometimes had, eyes that seemed older than her years. "The big friends," she said simply. "They watch me sleep, keep bad dreams away." Then she turned the page, moving on to elephants, as if she hadn't just suggested that the bears from the mountain were somehow still watching over her. They didn't question her further, afraid of either reinforcing a delusion or, worse, discovering it wasn't a delusion at all. But Jacob found himself checking her window at night, looking for shadows that shouldn't be there, listening for sounds that didn't belong to suburbia. He never saw or heard anything unusual, but sometimes Lily's room felt different, warmer somehow, protected in a way he couldn't explain. And on the very rare occasions when she had nightmares, she would wake not crying, but making that rumbling sound, and the nightmares would fade as quickly as they had come, replaced by peaceful sleep. As Lily grew, her connection to animals only strengthened. Birds would land near her without fear, squirrels would approach her in the park, and cats that hissed at everyone else would purr in her presence. It wasn't that she did anything special, at least not that others could see. She was simply accepted by them, recognized as something different, something safe. Other parents commented on it, amazed at how their pets reacted to her, and Jessica and Jacob would smile and shrug, unable to explain that their daughter had been marked somehow, chosen by something wild and ancient, protected by guardians no one would believe in. The story Connor had told them about his grandmother's beliefs stayed with Jacob, a bridge between worlds. Is that what Lily would become? Someone who could walk between the human and natural worlds with equal ease. He watched her grow, watched her navigate both playgrounds and forests with the same confidence, and thought maybe it was true. Maybe that moment in the mountains, that impossible encounter with beings that shouldn't have cared about humans at all, had changed her in fundamental ways. Or maybe it had simply awakened something that had always been there, waiting for the right moment to emerge. Sometimes Jessica wondered what would have happened if they had reacted differently that first morning. If they had panicked, called for help, tried to drive away despite the bear's presence, would the animals have left? Would they have become the aggressive threats Connor had warned about? Or would something terrible have happened, some tragedy that would have made the local news and reinforced all the usual fears about wild animals? She thought probably the bears would have simply left, their test failed, their interest lost. But she was grateful they had stayed, grateful for their forced patience that had allowed something magical to unfold. Years later, when Lily was 5 and full of questions about everything, she asked about the bears directly. "Tell me about when I was a baby," she said one evening. "Tell me about the big bears who came to see me." They hadn't told her the story, had never shown her the video, but somehow she knew. So they told her, honestly and simply, about 3 days in the mountains when the world had become larger and stranger than they ever imagined. She listened with serious attention, nodding as if the story confirmed something she had always known. "They still watch," she said when they finished. "Not always, but sometimes. When I need them." And looking at their daughter, at the quiet confidence in her eyes, they believed her. The rational part of Jacob's mind, the part that had been educated in science and logic, had made peace with the inexplicable. Some things, he had learned, existed outside the boundaries of what could be measured and proven. The bears had taught him that. They had shown him that the world was far more complex and interconnected than he had believed, that consciousness and caring could exist in forms he had never imagined. It was humbling and wonderful and slightly terrifying to know that reality was bigger than his understanding of it. But mostly, it was a gift, a glimpse into mysteries that made life richer and more meaningful. Jessica's stories grew into a book, then a series, all centered around the idea that the natural world was more aware, more intentional than most people believed. Critics called them modern fairy tales, and she didn't correct them. But readers, especially parents, often wrote to her about their own strange encounters, their own moments when animals had behaved in ways that defied explanation. She realized their experience, while extraordinary, wasn't unique. All over the world, in quiet moments and remote places, the boundaries between human and animal, civilization and wilderness, were more permeable than anyone admitted. The bears had simply made it impossible for them to ignore. On Lily's 6th birthday, they received a package with no return address. Inside was a small wooden carving of 3 bears, beautifully detailed, sitting in a semicircle. The wood was worn smooth as if it had been handled many times over many years. There was no note, no explanation, but they knew it was from Connor. They placed it on Lily's dresser, and she smiled when she saw it, running her fingers over the carved bears with recognition. "They look just right," she said, though she couldn't possibly remember clearly enough to know if that was true. But maybe she did remember, in ways that went deeper than normal memory, in the place where extraordinary experiences embed themselves in the soul. That night, after birthday cake and presents and the chaos of a house full of 6-year-olds, Jacob found Lily sitting by her window, looking out at the darkness. "What are you looking at, sweetheart?" he asked, sitting beside her. She leaned against him, warm and small and precious. "Just checking," she said. "Sometimes I like to check if they're there." He looked out at their suburban backyard, at the fence and the neighbor's house, and the streetlight at the corner. No mountains, no forest, no possibility of bears. But Lily was looking beyond all that, seeing something he couldn't see, connected to something he could only glimpse. "Are they there?" he asked softly. She was quiet for a moment, then smiled. "Not tonight," she said, "but they're somewhere, and that's enough." He tucked her into bed, kissed her forehead, and stood in her doorway for a moment, watching her settle into sleep. The carved bears on her dresser caught the nightlight's glow, seeming almost alive in the soft light. And just before he closed the door, he could have sworn he heard it. So faint it might have been imagination, a low rumbling purr that could have been the heating system or a truck passing on a distant road. But he knew better. He knew it was Lily, speaking in her sleep in the language she had learned before she could walk, maintaining a connection that time and distance couldn't break. The story of the bears became family legend, told and retold, each telling adding new details remembered or imagined. But the core of it never changed, the truth of it too powerful to be altered by time. 3 bears had come to them in the mountains, had watched and waited, and ultimately blessed them with a trust that transcended species. They had shown Jacob and Jessica that parenthood meant protecting not just from danger, but from the poverty of a world without wonder. And they had given Lily something precious and indefinable, a place in the larger family of living things, a citizenship in the wild world that most humans had forgotten they belonged to. Sometimes, when Jacob read news about habitat destruction or species extinction, he thought about those 3 bears. Were they still out there? Still living their mysterious lives in the mountain forests? He hoped so, needed to believe they were. They had become, in his mind, symbols of everything that was still wild and free and beyond human control. They were reminders that the earth didn't belong to humans alone, that there were other consciousnesses, other ways of being, that deserved respect and space and the chance to exist on their own terms. The bears had given them a gift, but they had also delivered a responsibility, an understanding that came with obligations. Jessica often wondered what had brought the bears to them specifically. Why their cabin? Why their family? Why Lily? She had read every scientific paper she could find about bear behavior, looking for precedents, but found nothing that explained what they had experienced. The closest she came were the indigenous stories Connor had mentioned, tales of spirit animals and chosen children, of tests and blessings and connections that modern science had no framework to understand. She chose to believe it had been exactly what it seemed, a moment of grace, a crack in the wall between worlds through which something magical had stepped. As Lily grew older, her unusual connection to animals became simply part of who she was. Teachers noticed it on field trips, friends' parents commented on it at parties, but for Lily it was normal. She didn't remember the bears consciously, she said, but she knew them in a deeper way. They were part of her foundation, the bedrock experience that had shaped how she moved through the world. She was fearless but not reckless, confident but not arrogant, aware that she was part of something larger than herself. The bears had taught her, before she could even understand the lesson, that strength could be gentle, that wildness could be protective, that love could cross any boundary. One autumn, when Lily was 8, they finally returned to the mountains. Not to the same cabin, but to the same general area, camping this time, wanting to show Lily the landscape of her first miracle. They hiked during the days, showing her the aspens turning gold, the mountain streams running clear and cold. She loved it all, moving through the forest with an ease that seemed inherited rather than learned. On their last night, sitting around the campfire, she suddenly went still, her head tilted as if listening to something. "They're here," she said quietly, and Jacob felt every hair on his body stand up. They looked into the darkness beyond the fire's light but saw nothing. Then, so faint they might have imagined it, came a sound. A low rumble, almost below the range of hearing, more felt than heard. It lasted only a moment, then was gone, but Lily was smiling, her face peaceful and satisfied. "They remember," she said simply. "They wanted to say hello." Jessica reached for Jacob's hand, and they sat there, the three of them, surrounded by darkness and mystery and the knowledge that they were not alone. Somewhere out there, 3 bears moved through the forest, going about their wild lives, but carrying with them the memory of a baby who had shown no fear, who had reached out with perfect trust and changed everything. The next morning, as they packed up camp, Jacob found tracks near their tent. Large, impossibly large, the prints of a bear that must have been enormous. But there were no claw marks, no signs of investigation or disturbance. Just the prints, proof of passage, a signature left in the earth. He showed them to Jessica and Lily, and they stood looking at them for a long moment, understanding the message. The bears had come to check on them, to see the child they had once watched over, now growing into herself. It was a goodbye, perhaps, or maybe just an acknowledgement that the connection remained, stretched thin by time and distance but unbroken. They drove home with the windows down, mountain air gradually giving way to the thicker atmosphere of lower elevations. Lily fell asleep in the back seat, and Jessica and Jacob rode in comfortable silence, each processing the experience in their own way. They had thought the story of the bears was finished, a closed chapter from Lily's infancy, But they understood now that it would never really end. It would continue to ripple through their lives, shaping who they were and how they saw the world. The bears had given them a lens through which everything looked different, more alive, more connected, more meaningful. That winter, Lily drew a picture that she gave them for Christmas. It showed 3 bears and a small human figure, all holding hands in a circle, which should have been impossible given the bears' lack of hands, but in the drawing it looked perfectly natural. Above them she had drawn stars, and below them roots that connected underground, joining them all in an endless loop. "This is us," she explained, "all of us connected forever." Looking at the drawing, at their daughter's understanding of connection that transcended physical presence, Jacob and Jessica knew she was right. They were all part of the same story now, the humans and the bears, bound together by 3 days of impossible grace. The drawing went on the refrigerator, where visitors would sometimes ask about it. "Lily loves bears," Jessica would say simply, and leave it at that. But sometimes someone would look at the drawing more closely, would see something in it that made them pause, made them remember their own strange encounters with the natural world. And sometimes, very rarely, someone would say, "Something like this happened to me once." And a new story would emerge, another crack in the wall between worlds, another moment when the universe revealed itself to be stranger and more wonderful than most people dared to believe. Years passed, and Lily grew into a young woman who studied ecology and conservation, driven by a connection to the natural world that her professors found remarkable. She never told them about the bears, understanding that some truths were too large for academic discussion. But her work was informed by that early experience, by the knowledge that animals were more than resources or subjects for study. They were beings with their own intelligence, their own purposes, their own capacity for connection. Her research focused on human-wildlife coexistence, on finding ways for both to thrive in an increasingly crowded world. The bears, she knew, had been trying to teach them something about this, about the possibility of different species recognizing each other as family. Jacob and Jessica, now older, would sometimes sit on their porch in the evenings, watching the sky darken and remembering those 3 days in the mountains. They had lived a whole life since then, full of normal joys and sorrows, but nothing had ever matched the pure wonder of that experience. It had been their glimpse behind the curtain, their proof that reality was far more magical than most people suspected. They had been chosen, for reasons they would never fully understand, to witness something extraordinary, and in witnessing it they had become part of it, carriers of a story that proved the world was full of mysteries worth preserving. On what would have been their last night in the cabin all those years ago, though they hadn't known it at the time, the 3 bears had sat in their vigilant semicircle, patient as mountains, waiting for something even they might not have fully understood. They had been drawn by instinct older than thought, by connections that existed in the spaces between heartbeats, in the shared breath of all living things. They had come to witness new life, to offer protection, to forge a bond that would ripple outward in ways no one could predict. They had come because sometimes, just sometimes, the universe arranges meetings between souls that need to know each other, even if they wear different skins and speak different languages. The large bear, the one that had first made the rumbling purr that soothed baby Lily, carried scars from many seasons of life in the mountains. It had fought other bears, survived harsh winters, raised cubs of its own, but nothing in its long life had prepared it for the pull it felt toward the cabin, toward the small human inside who called out in a frequency only certain hearts could hear. It had answered that call, bringing its companions, maintaining a vigil that its bare mind couldn't fully comprehend, but its deeper self knew was necessary. When the tiny hand had touched its fur, something had completed itself. Some circuit had closed, some ancient promise had been kept. The two smaller bears, younger and less scarred, had followed the large one out of trust and their own sensing of something important. They had sat through sun and rain, through day and night, watching the incomprehensible human dwelling with its strange smells and sounds. But when the baby had emerged, when her laughter had rung across the clearing, they had understood. This was what they had come for. This small being who looked at them without fear, who reached toward them with pure love, who spoke their language without knowing she was speaking it. She was bridge and blessing, proof that the walls between worlds were thinner than anyone knew. Inside the cabin, those 3 days had been a crucible that transformed the Bennett family forever. Jacob had entered it as a man who believed in the solid reality of the material world, who trusted in locks and walls and human superiority over nature. He had left it understanding that consciousness came in many forms, that intelligence didn't require language, that love could exist between species that should be predator and prey. The change in him was subtle but profound, affecting every decision he would make from that point forward, every way he would teach Lily about her place in the world. Jessica had been changed too, though her transformation was different. She had always been more open to mystery, more willing to believe in connections that couldn't be measured. But the bears had given her proof, had validated every intuition she'd ever had about the aliveness of the world. They had shown her that motherhood extended beyond her own species, that the fierce protective love she felt for Lily was echoed in the natural world in ways that transcended biological imperatives. The bears had been mothers and fathers too, in their own way, watching over a young one who needed witnessing. And Lily, too young to remember consciously but old enough to be imprinted by the experience, had been given a gift that would shape her entire life. She had been claimed by the wild world before she could walk, had been recognized and accepted by beings that most humans would only ever fear. The rumbling purr the bear had made to soothe her had become part of her own vocabulary, a sound she would make throughout her childhood when she was happy or comforting others. It was her first language, older than words, speaking directly to the part of the brain that remembered when humans were just another animal in the forest, no more or less important than any other. The cabin itself had been a character in the story, a stage set for an extraordinary performance. Its walls had contained a family's fear and wonder, had stood between the human and wild worlds while simultaneously being the place where those worlds met. Every creak of its boards, every rattle of its windows, had been part of the conversation between species. It had sheltered the humans while allowing them to be seen, had been permeable enough for connection while solid enough for safety. After the Bennetts left, other families would rent it, would comment on how peaceful it felt, how safe, never knowing that it had been blessed by guardians, marked as a place where miracles had walked. Connor Adams, the cabin's owner, had felt the change in the place when he'd gone to clean it after the Bennetts left. Nothing was different physically, but the air felt different, charged with something he couldn't name. He had found the bear tracks, measured them, marveled at their size. But more than that, he had felt the presence of his grandmother's stories, the old wisdom she had tried to pass on about the thin places where worlds touched. He had known, without being told, that something important had happened there. That's why he had called them, why he had sent the carved bears years later. He was a keeper of the story too, even if he only knew its edges. The mountains themselves had witnessed countless such meetings over the millennia, moments when different forms of consciousness recognized each other across the vast spaces of difference. The indigenous peoples who had first lived there had known this, had built their understanding of the world around the knowledge that animals were relatives, not resources. They would have understood immediately what had happened at the cabin, would have recognized it as the same kind of initiation they encoded in their stories and ceremonies. The bears were teachers, they would have said, and the child had been chosen to learn. But what had the bears taught exactly? It wasn't something that could be reduced to words or lessons. It was more like a transmission, a downloading of understanding that bypassed the rational mind entirely. They had taught that fear was a choice, not an inevitability. They had taught that size and power didn't necessarily mean threat. They had taught that patience could be a form of love, that watching could be protecting, that sometimes the bravest thing was to be still and wait for understanding to dawn. They had taught that every species had its own form of consciousness, its own way of experiencing the world, and that these different ways could touch each other in moments of grace. For Lily, growing up with this understanding embedded in her cells, the world had always been alive and communicative. Trees weren't just wood and leaves, but beings with their own slow thoughts. Birds weren't just pretty decorations, but messengers carrying news between earth and sky. The neighbor's cat wasn't just a pet, but a small predator tolerating human company while maintaining its essential wildness. This perspective made her both more connected to the world and sometimes lonely among humans who had forgotten these connections. But she had learned to translate between worlds, to help others remember what they had been taught to forget. The video on Jessica's phone had become a talisman of sorts, proof when doubt crept in that it had all really happened. Sometimes, late at night, she would watch it again, still amazed at the bears' stillness, their focused attention, the way they had arranged themselves like guardians around the cabin. She could see herself in the frame sometimes, a figure at the window, and remember the fear that had gradually transformed into wonder. The video couldn't capture the feeling of those days, the electric tension in the air, the sense of standing at the threshold of something vast and unknowable. But it proved that sometimes the impossible happened, that sometimes the world revealed itself to be far stranger than anyone imagined. Jacob had tried, over the years, to find rational explanations for the bear's behavior. He had read about habituated bears, about unusual weather patterns that might affect animal behavior, about the possibility of disease or injury that might cause atypical actions. But every explanation fell apart under scrutiny. The bears had been too healthy, too purposeful, too responsive to be explained by any normal circumstances. He had finally accepted that rational explanation wasn't always possible or even necessary. Some things existed outside the boundaries of human understanding, and that was okay. It was, in fact, wonderful. Proof that the universe still held mysteries, still had surprises in store. The story had become part of family lore, told at gatherings, shared with close friends who could be trusted not to mock or dismiss. And invariably, when they told it, someone would share their own story of an inexplicable encounter with the natural world. A deer that had stayed with an injured hiker until help arrived. A bird that had repeatedly tapped on a window until the homeowner discovered a gas leak. A dog that had detected cancer before any medical test. These stories formed a hidden network of evidence that the connections between species were stronger and more mysterious than science had yet discovered. As Lily entered her teenage years, she had gone through a period of questioning the bear story, wondering if her parents had embellished it, if her own memories were real or constructed from repeated tellings. But then she would make the rumbling sound, would feel it resonate in her chest in a way that felt ancient and true, and she would know. Her body remembered what her mind might doubt. The bears had left their mark on her in ways that transcended normal memory, had written themselves into her DNA, her instincts, her way of being in the world. One summer, working as a counselor at a wilderness camp, Lily had encountered a bear while leading a group of younger children on a hike. The other counselors had panicked, ready to follow the standard protocol of making noise, looking large, slowly backing away. But Lily had felt the same recognition she'd known all her life with animals. She had made the rumbling sound, soft and low, and the bear had stopped, tilted its head, and then simply walked away into the forest. The children had thought she was magic. The other counselors had thought she was insane. But Lily had known she was neither. She was simply someone who had been taught a different language, one that most humans had forgotten they once knew. The 3 days in the mountains had lasted only 72 hours, but their impact had stretched across decades, shaping 3 lives in profound ways. They had been a doorway into a larger understanding of the world, an initiation into mysteries that couldn't be solved but only experienced. The bears had been teachers, guardians, and witnesses, playing a role that human language had no proper words for. They had been proof that the universe was conscious in ways humans rarely imagined, that connections existed between all living things that science was only beginning to discover. In her college thesis, Lily had written about interspecies communication, carefully keeping her own experience out of the academic text, but letting it inform every hypothesis, every question she posed. Her professors had praised her intuitive understanding of animal behavior, never knowing that she had been taught by the best teachers possible. 3 grizzly bears, who had shown her that communication didn't require words, that understanding didn't require explanation, that love didn't require similarity. She had graduated with honors, but her real education had happened in a cabin in the mountains when she was 6 months old. Too young to remember, but old enough to be changed forever. Jessica's book series had grown into a phenomenon, translated into dozens of languages, touching readers around the world who sensed truth in her fiction. She received letters from children who said the books had helped them feel less alone, less strange for sensing the aliveness of the world. She received messages from parents who said the stories had helped them support their children's connections to nature rather than dismissing them as imagination. She had never explicitly written about the 3 bears, but they were in every story. Their presence the beating heart of every tale about the bridges between worlds. Jacob had become quieter over the years, more contemplative, carrying the weight of witnessed miracle like a secret treasure. He had become someone who noticed things others missed, the small communications between species, the subtle signs of the living world's consciousness. He would point these out to Lily when she was young, teaching her to see what he had learned to see. "Look," he would say. "See how the birds go quiet when that cat appears? They're warning each other. They have their own network." Or, "Notice how the trees lean toward each other. They're connected underground, sharing resources." He had become a translator of the natural world's languages, roles he never would have imagined before the bears. The large bear, the one that had touched Lily's foot with such impossible gentleness, lived for many more years in the mountains. It raised more cubs, survived more winters, added more scars to its collection. But something in it had changed after those 3 days at the cabin. Other bears could sense it, a difference that made them defer to it even more than its size demanded. It would sometimes return to the clearing where the cabin stood, would sit in the same spot where it had kept vigil, as if remembering or honoring something. Hikers occasionally reported seeing an unusually large bear in that area, one that seemed to watch them with unusual intelligence but never approached, never threatened, just observed with what they described as an almost human awareness. The 2 younger bears had gone their separate ways after leaving the cabin, but they too carried the experience with them. They were gentler with humans than their kind typically were, more likely to avoid than confront, as if they understood something about the potential for connection that other bears didn't. They passed this understanding on to their cubs in ways that couldn't be measured or proven, but that subtly changed the dynamics between humans and bears in that region. The aggressive encounters Connor had warned about became increasingly rare, replaced by a mutual wariness that contained respect rather than fear. The cabin continued to be rented to families seeking mountain solitude, and while none reported anything as dramatic as what the Bennetts had experienced, many mentioned a sense of being watched over, protected. Children especially seemed to love the place, would play for hours in the clearing where the bears had sat, would claim to see animals that their parents couldn't spot. The guest book filled with comments about peaceful nights and restful sleep, about dreams of friendly animals and waking with a sense of belonging to something larger. The cabin had become a thin place, where the veil between worlds was gossamer thin, where connections could be made for those ready to make them. Connor Adams eventually sold the cabin to a conservation group, ensuring it would remain unchanged, a place where the wild and human worlds could continue to meet. He included in the sale agreement a provision that the Bennett family could return whenever they wished, free of charge, though they never took him up on it. Some places, they understood, were meant to be visited only once, their magic too powerful to be casually revisited. But knowing it was there, knowing it remained a place where bears might still come to watch and wait, was comfort enough. The conservation group that bought the cabin found, when they surveyed the property, that it sat at the intersection of several major wildlife corridors. Animals had been passing through that clearing for thousands of years, following routes older than human memory. The cabin had been built unknowingly in a place that was already sacred to the wild world. A crossroads where different paths met. This explained, perhaps, why the bears had come there, why that particular place had been chosen for the extraordinary encounter. Or perhaps it explained nothing, just added another layer of mystery to an already inexplicable event. In her 20s, Lily had a dream that felt more like memory. She was tiny, held in her mother's arms, looking at 3 massive shapes that should have terrified her but didn't. In the dream, she could understand what the bears were saying, not in words, but in feelings, in knowings that went deeper than language. They were telling her about the old agreement, the one made before humans forgot they were part of the family of things. They were reminding her of responsibilities she would carry, bridges she would build, connections she would maintain. When she woke, she was crying, but they were tears of recognition, of remembering something that had always been true. She called her parents that morning, told them about the dream, and they talked for hours about those 3 days, sharing details they had never spoken before. Jessica admitted that she sometimes felt the bear's presence in moments of danger, a sense of being watched over that had nothing to do with imagination. Jacob confessed that he had never been able to kill anything since then, not even insects, feeling too keenly the consciousness in every living thing. They had all been changed, marked, initiated into an understanding that separated them from most of humanity while connecting them more deeply to life itself. The impact rippled outward in ways they would never fully know. Jessica's readers who found comfort and connection in her stories. The children at Lily's wilderness camps who learned to see animals as relatives rather than threats. The people who heard the story and began to pay attention to their own encounters with the more than human world. Each ripple created more ripples, spreading an understanding that the world was alive, conscious, and communicating constantly with those who knew how to listen. The 3 bears had started something that would continue long after all of them were gone, a thread of connection that would weave through generations.